Good evening. Welcome to the first edition of Khalistan Extremism Monitor's Punjab Security Matters series. Today we'll be focusing on the role of the diaspora, and our distinguished guest is Terry Milewski, who served for 4 decades as a correspondent for the Canadian Broadcast Corporation's television news service. He files stories from 52 countries. He's had a protracted relationship with India, and his first visit dates back to 1967 when he traveled to Punjab and also interviewed then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in Delhi. He later made frequent reporting trips to India and covered the 1985 Kanishka bombings in detail, from the day of the attack through the criminal trials and the judicial inquiry that ended in 2010. He has produced a series of TV documentaries and has written articles on the subject as well. His book, Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project, was published last year. To come to our subject today, the Sikh diaspora across the world is estimated at about 3.6 million, and they have a larger-than-life image almost everywhere they go. In keeping with their long-established traditions of open-hearted charity, the Sikh diaspora distinguished itself in particular during the protracted shutdowns of the COVID-19 pandemic, freely providing services and relief to vulnerable populations, even in countries where their own presence was minuscule. There is, however, a small, aggressive, and strident segment of radicalized Khalistanis within the Sikh diaspora that continues to push the extremist agenda. It is a matter of concern that recent manifestations of terrorism in Punjab have all been linked by investigators to elements within this diaspora. Most recently, on May 9, there was an RPG attack on the intelligence headquarters of the Punjab Police at Mohali, and the principal coordinator and facilitator of this attack has been identified as a prominent Khalistani in Canada. The Ludhiana court bombings of December 23 last year was linked to a Khalistani activist in Germany. A spate of targeted killings in Punjab since 2016 has also similarly been tied up to conspirators in the United Kingdom. While marginal today, the potential harm that these extremists in the diaspora could do is significant. Terry, I'd like to start by asking you, how do you explain extremist Sikhs in the diaspora who reject Western values and the systems and mores of their countries of adoption and make their central political purpose the creation of a religious state in India?
It's a puzzling question, and I think it's a good question to ask. Part of the answer is going to seem rather too obvious, but it's important to remember that the people who emigrated from India in the 80s and 90s to live in Canada, UK, United States, Australia, West Germany, all over the world, obviously they were self-selected for people who did not prefer to live in India. This may have been that they were economic refugees looking for a better life, as simple as that, but it may also have been, in many cases, it was that they were political refugees. They were fleeing because they risked arrest in many cases. And so you had a population in the diaspora. Canada has the largest proportion of more than 500,000 Sikhs now. You had a population that was self-selected for antipathy to India. So in that sense, it's not a surprise if they passed these feelings on to the next generation, which they wanted to do. It's also not a surprise that many of them had a simple lack of experience of what life is like actually in India today and how India has changed over the past 3 or 4 decades, a generation, in fact. They also got used to having control of the social and cultural centers of the expat community, the Gurdwaras. Control not just of the revenues of those Gurdwaras, but also of their politics. So the average person might go to the Gurdwara every week and just look away when a bunch of Khalistanis were handing out leaflets and proselytizing in the Gurdwara, but they didn't then get into battle to take over the Gurdwara for what you might call the moderate wing, because most people don't get involved in politics. They have other things to do, like every other expat community. Sikhs in Canada were interested in getting the kids to school on time, making a living, getting ahead, and all the other quotidian interests of expatriate communities. So there's a few different reasons. And finally, I must mention the intimidation. There was indeed, less so today, but it's not over. There was intimidation by the separatists of those who did not support them. So that if you kept quiet, if you did go to the Gurdwara every week and look the other way as the Khalistanis did their thing, and you didn't bother them, no problem. But if you did speak out, then it could be bad for your health. By which I mean, for example, a friend of mine, Balraj Deol in Toronto, 1985, he called a press conference. He was a young fellow, 28 years old. The theme of the press conference was Give Peace a Chance. He and some Hindu friends had joined together in a sort of peace forum, and they called a press conference to say we should give the Longowal Agreement between the Sikhs of Punjab and its then leadership and the government of Rajiv Gandhi, as it then was in New Delhi. He said, let's give peace a chance. For that crime, he was met in his parking lot late at night by 5 guys with baseball bats who beat him almost to death. They left him for dead. It was just pure chance that somebody happened to come by late at night and find him and call an ambulance. He barely survived. So for all of, it's rather a long answer, I grant you, but for all of those reasons, it's not a mystery why the old idea of an independent Sikh state survives in the diaspora, and it's become more recently more desperate because of the evident lack of support.
If I can just add something to what you said, Terry, very recently there was a Baisakhi procession in Italy, where the committee organizing had objected to the participation of some of the Khalistani groups. And there were scuffles, there were some intimidation, and eventually the Khalistanis forced themselves in their banners and their portraits into the procession. So what you talk about intimidation is not something that just happened, but it is something that is happening even now.
Yes.
There is an important psychological issue that is hard to understand. And I think with your long exposure to the subject, you might be able to help us. Sikhism has perhaps the deepest traditions of chivalry, of honor in war, of a war ethic. Now, how do these elements, these extremist elements in the diaspora, reconcile the Sikh warrior ethic with the murder of innocent?
Well,
the Kanishka bombing, 329 people, innocent people, unrelated people killed, people pulled off buses and slaughtered, people pulled off trains and slaughtered. And these are their martyrs. These are their glorious warriors. How does this reconciliation occur?
Well, the short answer is they don't reconcile it. They are not challenged to do so. They avoid the topic, and they obfuscate and lie about it. Lie is a big word, but I mean, their prevailing big lie, as you rightly point out, is that they hold up, for example, the author, the ringleader of the Kanishka plot, the bombing of Air India Flight 182 in June of 1985. They hold him up as a hero and a martyr of the Sikh nation. Shahid Bhai Jatadar Talvinder Singh Parmar. They hold him up as a hero of the Sikh people and a model for Sikh youth, which is absolutely baffling. I mean, you can ask until you're blue in the face, how do they explain this? How do they reconcile this? Well, they just lie about it. Say, oh, he was innocent. You say, well, I mean, it's been an established fact for 30 years. There's been a series of trials. The evidence has been tested publicly, transparently, in professional, fair trials. It is
trials outside India, if I may add over there, trials in Canada.
Yes, yes, in which it has been an established fact that the Kanishka was blown up by bombs ordered by Parmar from his bomb maker in Riyadh, who was convicted and who confirmed all of this and who was under surveillance at the test bombing with Parmar. I mean, there's no doubt about any of this, nor is there any doubt about the fact that those bombs, the ones that Parmar ordered from Riyadh, were indeed the ones that blew up that day and took the lives of 331 completely innocent civilians. So you say, well, how does this make any kind of sense with the warrior ethic of the traditional Sikh belief system? And the answer is it doesn't. They don't try. They have never answered the question, well, what did Parmar want the bombs for? How come his bombs were the ones that killed all those people? If he's, how do you say he's innocent? Well, they get away with it because they're not challenged on that internally. And the rest of Canada is frankly bored with the whole subject. They don't bring it up. It's just a sort of interesting cultural quirk of a tiny minority in the Sikh community. They vote for us at election time, so let's not say anything about it.
Just to come back to what you're saying about Canada, it's a wider phenomenon, in fact. Across the West, we see that there seems to be a failure to both acknowledge and act against these extremists. You write in your book, you say Canada was where Sikh terrorism cases went to die.
Yes. Yes. There's
been a consistent pattern of denial.
Yes.
Yes, please. You've seen even today, you see acts of the glorification of terrorism, groups that are banned in Canada itself, or in the UK in other cases, or in other countries across Europe. Their symbols, their portraits of their so-called leaders and martyrs, slogans for those groupings, which are banned groupings in the countries, host countries, are openly displayed. These events are attended by senior politicians of these host countries. So I'd like to take this a little further. Is it neglect? Is it errors of the judicial process or investigative process where cases are brought up? Or do you see this going further into a kind of a collusive framework?
I wouldn't go quite that far. I think it bears explaining, particularly for an Indian audience, that Canada is a peaceable country with very little experience of terrorism. They haven't been burned by the fire, except perhaps in the case of Air India, where they felt, well, this was a bunch of Indians who got blown up, not our problem. Many people felt that way. These weren't, principally the passengers on Flight 182 were not white ladies from Toronto. They were immigrant communities. They were overwhelmingly of Indian descent. Not our problem, they said. At the time, Canada's Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, called Rajiv Gandhi to offer his condolences for the killing of what, in fact, turned out to be mainly Canadians.
Canadian citizens, yes.
That was just the mindset. So, and as a consequence of this, Canada's anti-terror system was not very systematic, to say the least. The police were advised repeatedly by Indian governments going all the way back to Indira Gandhi's time, going back to the early 80s when Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, was in power. The Indians pleaded with the Trudeau administration to arrest Parmar. They knew that he was a terrorist. He was already wanted for murder in India. Nothing was done. They applied for extradition. No, we can't do that. They didn't want to take sides in an Indian conflict. They thought it wouldn't hurt us.
But Terry, that's if I may just interrupt you here, this is then. Even today, we see the same patterns working out. Justin Trudeau, when he visited in India, was given lists of terrorists. He assured action, went back, nothing was done. Even in his own receptions, both in Mumbai and in actually his wife's receptions in Mumbai and Delhi, a convicted Khalistani terrorist was on the invitation list. He actually attended the Mumbai reception. So I find it, it's really, it doesn't seem they haven't learned a lesson. You can say, yes, Kanishka bombing badly mismanaged because they had no experience. The world has had a tremendous amount of experience in the last, more than three and a half decades, 3 decades since the Kanishka bombing. And Canada has also experienced terrorism. They cannot be so blinkered and so unaware, so naive as to believe that none of this matters.
Well, you make a very good point. It's very embarrassing for me as a Canadian to have to defend Canada's continuing naivete on this topic, and I won't defend it. I have no defense. I'm not going to argue that Canada has learned its lesson. It's evident that it is not. You point, for example, to the notorious visit of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to India in 2018, where, yes, it's true, a convicted Khalistani terrorist. He tried to murder an Indian cabinet minister on Vancouver Island in 1986. He was the shooter. He confessed that he was the shooter. He was the guy who put 2 bullets in this visiting cabinet minister from Punjab, Malkiat Singh Sidhu, in 86. And he was on the guest list, invited by Canada's High Commissioner to a glittering diplomatic reception in New Delhi, and another one in Mumbai, at which he posed for selfies with the Prime Minister's wife. Well, that wasn't a very pretty picture, was it? I mean, it was absolute craziness. And it reflects the complacency of the of the Canadian political system to the presence in the heart of it, in the executives of local district political associations, licking envelopes and dropping off campaign literature on behalf of the candidate for the party, doing the grunt work for political parties in Canada. These people included this gentleman, a convicted Khalistani terrorist. And this was considered normal. This was normalized by and I'm not picking on just the Liberal Party in Canada. The other parties have been playing the same game, playing footsie with the Khalistani lobby. And no, they have not learned their lesson. But I would repeat, though, that in the case of the Kanishka bombing, they certainly have to a degree learned the lesson about violent activities today. There is a great deal of internet activity today, lobbying and activities which they always try to keep just this side of the line of legality. For example, it's not illegal to put up a poster, a giant life-size martyr poster of Talvinder Parmar. It's not illegal. And Canadians have freedom of speech. As long as they're not actually engaging in violent activities, the police aren't going to act. And so the politicians think, well, freedom of speech, and they vote for me, so let's not make a fuss. That much, I agree with you, has not changed, and it's time for it to change.
May I just go back? You just said they vote for me, therefore they tolerate it. You have in your book pointed out very clearly that strong anti-Khalistani candidates have swept elections in some of the Sikh-dominated areas. So this argument that the liberal politician or politicians, all political parties in Canada, tend to act on the belief that the Khalistanis represent a certain bloc vote doesn't
despite
seem to
the evidence that that's wrong. Yes,
exactly.
Yes, and you're quite right to point that out, that there isn't much basis in fact for the complacency that I described in any of the political parties in Canada. There's no basis for thinking that the Khalistanis represent the Sikhs, other than the fact that they say they do, which is another fiction which is constantly propagated and has been for 35 years by the Khalistanis, that we are the authentic voice of the Sikhs. And I mean, I know you're going to puncture that claim too, as soon as I draw a breath, by pointing out the voting results in the place where most Sikhs actually live, namely in Punjab, where in 2017, what was it? Simranjit Singh Man's splinter group of the SAD, the only separatist party in the running, got 0.32% of the vote, a microscopic fraction of 1% of the vote. And in the more recent elections just finished, installing a new government in Punjab, they increased from practically nothing to almost nothing. So now they have 2.5% of the vote and still no seats. I mean, they've become completely irrelevant electorally in Punjab, where most Sikhs actually live. And so you're going to say, well, what possible reason would there be for a Canadian politician to think that if you're pro-Khalistani, you're pro-Sikh somehow? And the answer is there is no justification for it. The numbers don't add up. It's nonsense. But the bottom line really is that who speaks up during elections? It's the activists who speak up during elections. It's the Khalistanis who have mastered the art of lining up volunteers, block voting, going to the candidates before the election and say, look, I can get 10,000 people out to the Gurdwara and tell them to vote your way. I can get you elected, but you better sing my Khalistani song. And those who are less interested in politics, those who don't agree with the fight for Sikh independence, they're not particularly interested in Canadian politics either. They're not out there organizing. They lose by default, in other words.
Is there a broader context to this? In a sense, you see a great deal of both academic and liberal commentary, which treats not only Khalistani terrorism, but various patterns of terrorism extremely selectively often as some sort of an inchoate expression of democratic will. You know, you just said, in India, of course, these people have absolutely no electoral successes. In fact, I may add to you what you said. Even someone like Pindranwale, who was, very much larger in life when he was active, he had about 40 candidates stand for the SGPC election in 1979. Only 4 candidates won. And this is a closed election.
Yes.
With a representation of extremely conservative, extremely, you could say, orthodox Sikhs, who would be substantially sympathetic to the kind of line Pindranwale was at that point of time articulating. And there is absolutely, zero impact electorally. And yet you have across the world so much of academic literature coming out, so much of commentary, so much of popular commentary coming out, which says that, no, these people represent the will of the people. How do you explain this contradiction, this absolutely blatant contradiction between evidence and continued propagation, not by advocates of extremist ideologies, but by...
Well, you seem to be under the illusion that facts and evidence matter in politics.
and academics, as well?
Well, I mean, academics, it depends. Pick your academic. I mean, you're speaking to somebody who was recently attacked virulently online by a so-called group of Sikh academics and scholars who obviously never read the letter they signed, attacking me for saying things I did not say and which they could not identify. I mean, it was just a sort of crazy rant, which never quoted a single word that I actually said, but saying I'm a very bad man. And facts and evidence, no, they don't seem to matter in politics, even less so today. Let's face it, the entire politics of the world's leading democracy, the United States, is led by the big lie. It revolves around the big lie. And in Canada, the affairs of Sikh separatists in Canada, they revolve around a series of big lies. Oh, we never blew up Air India. The Indian government blew up their own plane. Talvinder Parmar is innocent. He was persecuted and rubbed out by the perfidious Indian state and so forth. it's all about lies, and you and I can speak to each other until we're blue in the face about how this is all proven false, obviously false, but it doesn't seem to do any good. But I repeat that the test is at election time. I mean, you alluded a moment ago to the fact that I've often pointed out that those who oppose the Khalistanis have also enjoyed electoral success over the years. Ajai Sahni is the name that many Indians will know. It became the premier of the great province of British Columbia and a federal cabinet minister in Ottawa, who very courageously stood up to the Khalistanis back in the day, at a time when he was getting routinely death threats against him and his family. Notes slipped under his door, phone calls on his answering machine. We're going to get you. We know where your kids play. And he was elected and re-elected for 20 years in Canada on that platform, in a heavily Sikh riding. So don't tell me that the Khalistanis are the voice of the Sikhs. But if you are not lucky enough to have somebody with the courage and eloquence of an Ajai Sahni running in your district, and you have somebody who is quietly behind the scenes in cahoots with the Khalistanis, and he's getting those 10,000 votes from the Gurdwara, then you have a different result.
Kind of reflection of the same kind of dynamic plays out on the social media today. You've pointed out in one of your articles that today the struggle of Sikh sovereignty is mainly digital. The social media presence of these strident voices is very substantial. What is the pattern? What are its sources? How is this dominance achieved? Does it again reflect a large discourse? Or is it a manipulated discourse?
It's very substantially manipulated. You will find, for example, that on Twitter, that the much of the noise that is generated online consists of retweets by I don't know if they're bots, but they're people who repeat each other, don't have any followers, have accounts that were just created using fake names and numbers, and which don't seem entirely literate. I mean, they can't spell. They don't know what they're raving about. However, there are a few, and I emphasize a few, who succeed at Twitter wars and have quite a substantial online presence. I'm thinking of one who has something like 300,000 followers on Twitter, in excess of that. So a substantial number, way more than you or me. And he tweeted, I guess it was last year, there was one tweet where he runs a charity operation in the UK. A lot of this comes out of the UK. And he tweeted in praise and honor of a colleague of Bhindranwale's at the Golden Temple in the Blue Star operation 1984. Well, if he didn't say what this individual that he was honoring, Nagoke was the name, what he had actually done, what his claim to fame was. It was just a tweet saying this was a great guy. Well, actually, if you know anything about it, you know that this great guy was actually a hitman for Bhindranwale. He was a serial killer. He took a shot at the president of India, Zail Singh, for example. He was claimed to be the shooter in the notorious shooting of a senior police officer, Atwal, in 1983, I guess it was, at the Golden Temple, and so on. So the point of the story is that the guy who was being praised on Twitter by this individual with in excess of 300,000 followers was a serial killer. But you wouldn't have known that unless you were in the know, and the tweet would have just gone right over your head. In other words, the tweet, and this is my point, would have had absolutely no effect in terms of getting new supporters for the Khalistan cause. It would only be understood by those who were already part of the cause. And this is the problem they're having. There is a lively, active, vocal, and skilled online presence. They're good at getting bots to mass report you so that Twitter will automatically suspend your account. They're good at that sort of negative propaganda. There's another couple of guys who founded the National Sikh Youth Federation in the UK. Young guys, English accents, grew up in England, weren't even alive back in the day in 1984. And one of them tweeted a sort of death threat against me. Two problems. It was doubly dumb. First, because it's not a very good idea. It's not very smart to tweet a death threat in your own name publicly. It's not good for your reputation. You'd think they would know that. Second of all, he forgot to tag me. How was I supposed to be intimidated exactly if I didn't know about it? If I didn't know this threat existed. So again, this might have had an effect, a rallying effect, brownie points within the Khalistani bubble, but not outside it, because nobody would know what this guy was talking about, not even me, and I was the target. Another guy with the same background, a colleague in National Sikh Youth Federation in the UK, which is deliberately named after the International Sikh Youth Federation, which is a banned terrorist organization, as you know, in India, the UK, Canada, around the world. And he tweeted some absolutely crazy stuff about the Air India bombing of 1985, saying, oh, well, they were freedom fighters, not terrorists. So I guess it's okay. Oh, and the casualties, he said, were unintended. But can you imagine, you put a bomb on a plane and the casualties are unintended? The passengers are going to die. You know, I mean, this sort of lunacy online basically ensures, I think, that their online propaganda is ineffective. But the most vocal of all at the moment is this organization Sikhs for Justice, Absolutely. Which has a very considerable online presence, mostly on Facebook. Their Twitter accounts get shut down pretty quickly upon Indian requests, and they only pop up very rarely. But they're the people, Sikhs for Justice, who are organizing the so-called referendum on Sikh independence. They've had a vote in the UK, they've had one in Geneva, they say they're going to announce some voting in Himachal Pradesh on June the 6th. It's the referendum 2020. You may notice that there were 2 years after 2020 and we haven't had it yet, but blame the pandemic for that. And Sikhs for Justice is very present on the internet. They have a lot of different Facebook groups that have pledged allegiance to the cause, and they're led by a New York lawyer named Gopalwant Singh Panun. And what are they doing? Well, they're issuing warnings and blood-curdling threats against Indian politicians, particularly in Punjab, against Captain Amarinder back in his day, against his successor and now his new successor in the Punjab government. And they picked, this is something I found quite significant, as the poster boy for their campaign for the referendum online, Talvinder Singh Parmar, the mastermind of the Air India bombing. They put up posters and they called their Canada headquarters for the campaign the Shaheed by Jateda Talvinder Singh Parmar Voter Registration Center. Now, I ask again, do you think that's calculated to attract supporters? What could be better calculated to drive people away than picking Canada's worst ever mass murderer as the poster boy for your campaign? So I would suggest that as loud as they are on the internet, they're hardly effective. It seems to be about rallying the troops who are already with you, not gathering new supporters. Therefore, I think that as loud as it is, it's been very ineffective.
But there is what we see today, some kind of an impact in Punjab as well. Several of these communications have been backed with offers of substantial rewards for particular actions. What we're also seeing in the recent cases of actual terrorist attack, what I mentioned, the attack on the headquarters of the Punjab Police Intelligence Wing,
Mohali.
The Mohali attack, the earlier Ludhiana court bombing, the earlier targeted killings after 2016, right up to 2021. Most of the people who are being drawn in are mercenaries with criminal backgrounds. They're not ideologically mobilized. So it's not just that this constituency is reaching out of that bubble that the internet bubble that you're speaking of, and is actually mobilizing individuals to particular patterns of action. Extreme in these cases, but lesser actions like raising a flag here or some kind of a symbolic action elsewhere, putting up posters for the SFJ. So that it isn't as if they are entirely without impact.
No, they are having an impact on some tiny minority of, let's be blunt, nutcases. And they also discredit themselves in the wider public. For example, they offered a new iPhone to anyone who would fly a Khalistani flag when the iPhone 12 came out. And so what are we to conclude? If somebody flies the Khalistani flag, we conclude that, well, they probably needed a new phone. It doesn't mean anything about their burning desire for an independent state called Khalistan. And there are many other obvious holes in the argument. As I say, that discredits them as basically bribing people to pretend to be Khalistanis for the day. There are many other holes in their propaganda. People have been asking, they often ask me, for example, where can we find out about what is this Khalistan? Where is it? Invariably, you notice that they never make any claims upon Pakistan. Pakistani Punjab is autonomous. They never make any claims on Pakistan, notwithstanding that in Pakistani Punjab, of course, many, if not most, of the holiest Sikh sites are to be found, to include Lahore, for example, which was only the seat of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Sikh empire 200 years ago. So this is holy ground for the Sikhs. What about the birthplace of Guru Nanak, the first Sikh guru?
Yes.
Nankana Sahib. They don't claim that either. So they seem very concerned not to antagonize their Pakistani friends. Pakistanis, of course, having provided safe haven and shelter and support and training and weapons to the militants back in the day, and still support them politically today. They make no claims upon Pakistan. Well, why is that? Well, there are various sort of crazy excuses when you ask them that question. And they say, well, we want to have a referendum in areas where there's a Sikh majority, and that's not the case in Pakistan. Oh, okay. So let's have a look at the map. They've recently produced a new map. This was produced on the anniversary of the assassination by her Sikh bodyguards of Indira Gandhi. So the end of October of 1984.
31st, yes.
Yes, and at the end of October of last year, they issued a new map, new and improved, making large claims, not just on Indian Punjab, but on parts of Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh and all of Himachal Pradesh and on and on. And the capital was going to be in Shimla. Well, was Shimla's a Sikh holy site? I hadn't heard that before, but I guess it is now. So they continue with this sort of inexplicable series of claims which cannot be supported by any sort of rational argument. Rational argument is not what they're about. It's about rallying the troops for the old cause. It's about control of the Gurdwaras. It seems to be a good money-making enterprise. One way to show you're a good Sikh might be, oh yeah, well, I made a contribution to the cause. That shows that I'm a good Sikh, and I've got friends among people who are prepared to use muscle. That's one of the important elements of it today.
I've got a number of questions now piling up, Terry.
Go ahead.
I just have one of my own, which I'll end our discussion with, and then we'll go to responding to the other interventions. Crucially, we've seen how they gather force, and we see how what would be, I think, an overwhelming majority of Sikhs and of others, people of other faith who are opposed to this kind of a violence. How can these campaigns of falsehood be confronted? How do we escape this trap of, the worst being full of this passionate intensity and the best lying silent?
Yes, that's a good expression in this context. Good work digging that one up. I'll steal that idea. The short answer is that we have to constantly encourage politicians in the West, particularly. Politicians in India obviously get this. But we have to encourage politicians in the West to speak up about it in a way that notoriously in Canada, they've utterly failed. The Canadian bureaucracy, the national security bureaucracy, put out a report 2 or 3 years ago. That was, I think it was in 2018, taking note of the threat to national security from people who worship a mass terrorist as a big hero, for example. And there was a hullabaloo from the Khalistani lobby to the effect that, oh, no, you can't call us a threat. This is a terrible report. It must be withdrawn. And the Liberal government of the day caved in and rewrote the report. They dropped that language. Well, you ask, what can we do to push back? And the answer is we should call up those politicians and say, what are you doing? What voices are you listening to? Why are you withdrawing this report? How are you going to explain to us how it's not a problem for national security if there is a vocal minority who vote for your party at election time, who think that this guy Parmar is a big hero? It's madness. It's absolute madness. So it's up to citizens who find this objectionable to persuade and embarrass politicians, and it turns out they are capable of embarrassment. When it is found, for example, that they're going to Vaisakhi parades where pictures of gun-toting Sikh assassins are paraded through the streets of Surrey, British Columbia, on parade floats, when it is found that they're smiling and waving as these floats go by and hustling for votes, and again, politicians of all parties, all levels of government, municipal, provincial, federal, then they do get embarrassed and they stay away for a year or two. Then they come back. So we, as citizens, we need to do a better job of holding them to account.
On the internet, on this whole social media thing, do you see any kind of organic growth of voices against the Khalistan project, or do you still see an effective dominance of the Khalistanis on the discourse? And what is the volume of the discourse? I'd also like to...
I do see a very substantial pushback. I think there is a new generation who have noticed that they have been too silent in the past and that they have failed to push back in the past. are now speaking up now and getting very little pushback themselves from the Khalistanis. I'm thinking, for example, of a gentleman in New York, Sahni. He's a young guy, very scholarly, very knowledgeable about Sikh history. He is a Sikh. He's fluent in Punjabi, and he knows where all the bodies are buried. He knows the truth. And he's been campaigning, and there's been campaigns against him to have him suspended, which have ended in failure. They've had him suspended, and then he pushes back, and his account is restored. He has an account called Sikhs for Enlightenment Values, which is a significant title. Recently, for example, he's tweeted a little clip of a videotape that he found of Bindranwale back in the day. This is 1983. Threatening to kill, to chop to pieces, is the best translation I've had, 5,000 Hindus if the police did not return to him a bus that they had impounded. If he didn't get his bus back, he would kill 5,000 Hindus. Bear in mind, this is more than a year before Blue Star. It wasn't retaliation for Blue Star. This was a year and a half before the massacres of 1984, and the massacres of Sikhs. It wasn't retaliation for that either. This was Bindranwale's modus operandi. So Puneet Sahni pushed back against this, but he tweeted the videotape. Well, what do you say about that? Answer? Still waiting. Haven't seen an answer. Silence. They don't want to get into that. They don't have an answer. How are they going to explain that this isn't a terrorist threat? He's threatening to kill Hindus because they're Hindus. So I find this of significance. The feebleness or the complete absence of pushback from the Khalistani lobby, such as it is, reveals to me, something I often say is that when you look at the reaction from the Khalistani internet lobby, you tend to find that it's always the same 8 people. The same names again and again and again, and then a few bots, and no doubt there are a couple of hundred actual real people who support them, but forgot to get on Twitter today. Maybe they would.
The source accounts are very small, where original material is coming from. Yes.
Yeah. And so they pretend to have significance. They pretend to be the voice of the Sikhs still, but most people don't follow them. They look away. They're not interested. It's an old story. They're not getting any traction, and it's no surprise because the extreme lack of sophistication on the part of people who plainly have no experience in real politics in democratic countries, no idea how to win a dialogue using facts and evidence. They just don't live in that world. They just believe that yelling insults and telling lies, they believe that this is what the internet is good for. And most people, frankly, are just tuning it out.
Right. We've got a whole lot of questions piled up, which are going to give you an opportunity to, I think, elaborate a little more on some of the points you've made, some of the points we haven't really got to. This is a big discussion. Many issues are going to come in. We have a question here which says, this is Mayukh Chakrabarti, who says, is there any link of Khalistanis with other foreign terrorist organizations? And I think...
Yes. Yes. Short answer, Kashmir. Easiest way to explain this is to look at the death in 1992 of Talvinder Parmar. When the police closed in, he fled Canada. This is 30 years ago now. And he operated in Pakistan for 3 years with the help of the Pakistani ISI. And was caught by the Punjab police inside Indian Punjab in October of 1992 in the company of 5 other men, 2 of whom were Pakistani ISI agents. Or let me correct that. One was a Pakistani ISI agent. The other was a Kashmiri masquerading under false papers as a Pakistani, but who was also an ISI agent. So he's pretending to be a Pakistani. But actually he was a Kashmiri. And so was the Inkitab Ahmed Zia, who was quite an important ISI agent who died alongside Parmar in a lentil field, the little village of Kangarayan, on October the 15th of 1992, so just about 30 years ago. This is of significance. Here were heavily armed and well-financed. Zia he was carrying the money. The Pakistani guy was carrying the money. He was a card-carrying Islamist, a jihadist, whose business was supporting the struggle in Kashmir against India. And they referred to the alliance as the K2, Kashmir and Khalistan, the K2 alliance, whereby the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If you're against India, if you're out to bleed India in revenge for the 1971 war, don't get me started on that. If you're with me on that, we'll join hands. Kashmiri Islamists and jihadists did, and to some degree still do,
yes,
join hands with the Khalistanis, yes.
You mentioned Puneet Sahni in your response earlier, Terry, and we've got Puneet coming in over here. He says, couldn't the government have just shown that 1-minute clip of Pindranwale where he's threatening to slaughter 5,000 Hindus in 1 hour if his bus wasn't released by 5 p.m.? Most kids with Pindranwale tattoos don't know what he said and did. It's more of a comment, but I think maybe you'd like to respond to that.
Yeah, I think Puneet is right about that there is an obligation on folks like you and me and him to publish the truth.
I think what he's saying is there's an obligation also on governments. And that's the point he's trying to make. He says, couldn't the government have shown these clips?
Indeed, although we don't have a government media in Canada, and I'll let you speak for India. We don't have in Canada a government media organization that said, okay, well, we will follow the government policy to announce it. We don't have a propaganda ministry. People will say, well, you work, Terry, for the CBC. Isn't that a government media? Well, no, it isn't. I've never, ever failed to antagonize every single government I ever covered in Canada. None of them wanted anything to do with me. They wouldn't give me interviews. They didn't like me. As long as I was equally hated by all parties, I felt fine about that.
You've done a good job, yes.
I guess I must have done something right. But Puneet's point is a good one. But as a practical matter, Indians do have a bit of a problem with the way things work in Canada. They say, well, why doesn't Canada ban the Khalistanis? Why don't they silence them? Well, we have freedom of speech. We're not in the silencing business. I've been told by colleagues in India that, well, look, Terry, you've got to remember that in India, free speech is not a thing the way it is for you. Well, again, I'll let you speak for India. I'll just speak for Canada. But no, there isn't a way where the government decrees that we shall expose and condemn people whose politics we deplore. And it happens. They don't have an agency, they don't have a means, and they don't have the legal structure to do that.
I've got another message from Manpreet Kaur. She says, sir, my family went to Punjab last week and saw lots of radicalization all over. I might not agree with that assessment. I go to Punjab very often. But nevertheless, he is stunned to seeing Pindranwale posters on cars written as Saint and yellow flags in front. How can we eradicate this thing from Punjab? Please share your views on this.
Well,
I will agree to a certain extent that you do see a measure of such messaging. On an occasional vehicle, you will see an occasional icon here or there. I would not think there is a great deal of this, but there are pockets. Certainly, I would not question that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should not exaggerate it, but it does exist, and I would venture to say that the election results, they tell us something about the degree of support for a separate state. Remember, that's the soft option, a peaceful option. It's not people weren't given the option to vote for all-out war on the Indian state in the name of an independent Khalistan. That didn't happen. Even if you ask for the softer option, a peaceful democratic emergence in response to a vote of an independent state, even that at the moment got a pitiful 2.5% of the votes in Punjab. So I think there is a way for her to speak up and to say this is nonsense. But we should all remember that it's very easy for me sitting in Canada to say, well, why don't you take these guys on? Why don't you confront the youth with the Bindranwale tattoo? It's like, did you realize, who this guy really was? Do you realize he was out to kill Hindus? Do you realize that he was a religious fanatic? Do you realize he didn't particularly have anything much to say about Khalistan? I mean, he was more of a religious Puritan, railing against alcohol and tobacco. And if you asked him, about Khalistan, said, well, if we get Khalistan, that'd be nice, but it's not his thing. And much else that you should know. She is free to confront that individual, but it might be a difficult day for her because the violence is always implied and it's very close beneath the surface. And she could be running a risk. The guy with the Bindranwale tattoo is not necessarily a nice guy. And so before you march up to him on your own in a dark alley and take him on, as I'm recommending, think.
Actually, what you're saying is very true. When we speak to people for participation in our discussions, coming on a public platform, there is a significant degree of reticence. There is a sense, if not of fear, at least of some degree of apprehension. I've also, to my remarks, received several immediate responses. One which has come in my private messages, so I won't mention the name. It says, Ajay ji, Manpreet is right. I have seen hundreds of motorcycles while on Hola in Anandpur Sahib Road. This is the Hola Mohalla celebration during March. And he says this presence continued till Chandigarh civil lines. So on particular occasions, religious occasions, you will see, I would agree, much more of the manifestation of such a symbols and activities. So I would concede that while on a daily basis, you may not see a very widespread presence, there is certainly a presence on religiously significant occasions. Talking about the Pakistani angle, the entire support basis, we have Pankaj Sain saying, do you think the FATF is sufficient to deal with Pakistan's acts of supporting not only Khalistan terrorism, but all terrorism? Is there a need for another organization similar to FATF, but more strict? So how does the international community effectively exercise pressure to contain Pakistan's role in supporting all patterns of terrorism, including the Khalistan?
Well, it's not very effective, is it, currently? I mean, I think this is an important question because the FATF,
Pakistan's been there on the grey list for 4 years now.
Well, Pakistan's a grey list, but not black.
Exactly.
Grey, but not black.
And grey is nothing. Yes.
Yes, and that's important because Pakistan is becoming, if it isn't already, a wholly owned subsidiary of China. It's deeply indebted to China. Imran Khan in his day only added to this to make Pakistan a sort of client state of China, an extension of China, and beholden to China's political agenda for many years to come, if not permanently. And it would be, of course, absolutely crippling for Pakistan in terms of paying its debts, even servicing some of its debts to China, if it were to be placed on the blacklist instead of the grey list. And there is obviously some reluctance to do that on the part of the international community, and I will say for good reasons, because if you drive Pakistan further into despair and into the arms of China, have you done a good thing? I mean, is, like, better to work with them perhaps than to drive them into the ditch and then reap the consequences of whatever emerges from that. So there is, of course, always more that the international community could do to recognize the terrible impact that Pakistani adventurism has had. Look at Afghanistan as another example.
Absolutely.
That's worse than the case of Kashmir or Khalistan. Khalistan, they basically, it's cost-free for Pakistan to support rhetorically and sometimes financially the Khalistan movement, and to indulge these characters like this gentleman Chawla, who is a Pakistani Sikh who campaigns for the Khalistan cause within Pakistan. It's cheap for them. I mean, famously, I think it was Hamid Gul, former head of the ISI, who said, did he not, who told Benazir Bhutto in her day as prime minister, or one of her days as prime minister, that it's like having a division of the army in India, having the Khalistanis basically do our bidding for free, and there's, I suggest to you that and to the author of the question, that yes, there is certainly much more that the international community could do to make life difficult for Pakistan when it does engage in this kind of adventurism. The problem, of course, is that it's easy for me to say that and for you to agree with me, but what exactly are you going to do, and what whirlwind will you reap if you had, say, at the outset that, well, we're not going to get into bed with Pakistan to push the Russians out of Afghanistan back in the day. Now, you want to revisit all of that history and say, well, the West should have pursued a different policy and say, no, we're not going to help the Pakistani Taliban push the Russians out of Afghanistan. Well, I mean, this is pie in the sky. That would not have happened then. And it's a fantasy now to think that the international community would have acted that way in reality in the situation as it then was. Today, I think we have to be similarly careful. I don't think that there's any prospect. I don't think, we can talk about it, but I don't think there's any prospect of unbuckling Pakistan from China, and that this whole question that has been raised here, it's a whole other webinar, isn't it? About what absolutely. The West should do about China and its now satellite in Pakistan. It's a very complicated, difficult question, and I would only agree that it would be nice if we could do more, but it's way too complicated to get into now. I don't think it's a matter of waving a magic wand and say, put them on the blacklist.
We seem to be running out of time, Terry, but if you don't mind, could we extend this by about 15 minutes if you have
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, because I've got a whole lot of questions and some of them are really very interesting.
Okay, I'll try to give shorter answers and
no, it's been a very interesting discussion, and perhaps we will do this again. And there are so many, it's a big issue, it's a complex issue, and we need to bring it out perhaps in far greater detail than this short session has allowed us. Gurbani Bhutani says, how do you see Khalistanis misusing Sikh humanitarian services in Western countries? I think that's really, really an important issue.
Well, they do say that they're engaged in all kinds of humanitarian activities, and we should begin by conceding that to some degree that's true. There is indeed a long and honorable Sikh tradition of seva and of service to the community, feeding the poor, helping in disasters. We cannot dismiss that as though it's all fraudulent and fictitious. It isn't. Much of it is real and genuine, and it is in keeping with Sikh traditions as they really are. The problem, of course, is always that is when it latches on to the political cause of an independent state of Khalistan, then it gets corrupted, money gets siphoned off. There have been some very alarming court cases in Ontario and Canada, for example, the Ontario Khalsa Dabar case, where money was being siphoned off to who knows what cause, but it wasn't one that you or I would sanction. It was being siphoned off by Khalistanis for their own purposes. And it's very hard to disentangle enterprises which are very cunningly designed to put up a front operation saying, all we are is a Sikh charity. And it's very hard to discover sometimes exactly where that money is going because it isn't accountable. People go in the Gurdwara, they put some money in. Who's counting it? Where does it go? Where is the transparency? And the answer is to pursue transparency. The answer is in your Gurdwara, in your neighborhood, will you run a slate of candidates for the management of that Gurdwara, which will pledge itself to providing that transparency? To say, where is the money going? Here are the public accounts. They have been audited by the accountant who's here to answer your questions. Now that would be an advance. Yes. And sadly, that is not what's been occurring.
Right. I've got a question from Aditi Shodh. How do you see the difference between a new social media-based Khalistani movement and the old movement in the 1980s? Interesting.
Well, it's not that different. I will say that it's the continuation of the same battle by other means. Instead of blowing up airliners and pulling people off buses and machine gunning them in the ditch and blowing up markets and theaters and public places, now they're issuing mean tweets. And you will say, well, that's completely different. One is democratic politics and one isn't. I'm not sure that it's completely different when both are based on the same lie. They're both based upon a fascist idea that we're going to say that we are acting for the Sikh community without having any democratic legitimacy whatsoever. Nobody elected the Baba Khalsa to go and blow up a civilian airliner and kill 300 people. They were never elected. They had no democratic legitimacy. Nor does the guy today who's tweeting nonsense about Khalistan on Twitter and on Facebook. There's no democratic legitimacy for holding up Talvinder Parmar, the author of the bombing of Kanishka, holding him up as a holy martyr, as a model for Sikh youth. There's no democratic legitimacy for that. They haven't been elected to anything. That lack of legitimacy is the common thread in the old style Khalistani politics of violence and the new style Khalistani politics of internet yelling.
It's a question you have addressed, but perhaps we can revisit it momentarily. Pankaj Sain says, how does a small number of Khalistanis impact the larger political scenario in the West? Are the Khalistanis creating pressure groups in Canada and in other Western countries?
Yes, and they do a better job than many other groups. I mean, we have to give them credit. These people are not stupid. I mean, when they lick envelopes and pass out literature and do all of the grunt work out of a political campaign on the ground and acquire influence within the political parties in Canada or the UK, they are being smart. Because then when they go to the politician and say, look, we'd like you to come to our Vaisakhi, and oh, by the way, when you get there, we're not going to tell you, but there'll be some Khalistan flags on the stage behind you. I mean, this has happened as recently as last week. Yes. in Canada, where one of the candidates for the leadership of the Conservative Party indeed was at such an event with Khalistan flags in the background. So let's admit that these people are smart, they're clever, they do know what they're doing, they understand politics in democratic countries better than a lot of other groups. And their influence has been earned the hard way. I still think it should be resisted, but we have to give them credit for doing a good job. Tactically,
they've been very, very effective.
Yes.
I have a question from Raju Arora, which says, how seriously does the Indian government represent its problems with the Khalistan movement in Canada? Do you think the Indian response is adequate? Do you see a sufficient pressure coming from New Delhi on the government in Canada? Or do you think our diplomacy is inadequate, ineffective, misdirected?
Well, the question is going to get me in trouble because I'm going to say I'm going to say something bad about the Indian government. I think they have been too polite. We all like diplomats who are polite.
Yes.
And I should hedge what I'm saying by pointing out that behind the scenes, to my knowledge, a series of Indian high commissioners in Canada have been somewhat less polite than they are in public. Nevertheless, I think they have they've missed some opportunities to be louder, more vigorous, and to embarrass the Canadian government publicly. I'll give you an example. We mentioned earlier the 2018 visit of Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister, his trip to India in 2018, at which yes. A Khalistani terrorist embarrassingly appeared on the guest list at the Canadian High Commission, and that blew up in Trudeau's face, and it was a major embarrassment. That embarrassment came from the exposure of who was on the guest list. I mean, I was tipped off. I did a story on the CBC, and the rest is history. That exposure, though, could be blamed on me as a reporter and other reporters who got engaged in that story. But it wasn't thanks to the Indian government. The Indian government was, found out about it on the CBC. And then when asked about it, they firmly denied that they had anything to do with this, because of course the Khalistanis said, oh, well, it was the Prime Minister's office, it was the Indian government which arranged this invitation. The Indian government arranged for the Canadian High Commissioner to issue the invitation. No, that's not how it works at all. They had no power to issue invitations to the Canadian High Commissioner's party. But other than denying that they had anything to do with it, which is which is an honest denial. They were telling the truth. I know how it happened, and it wasn't because the Indian government arranged it. They didn't have the power to arrange it, and they didn't know that this guy would be going to the dinner. They weren't asked to approve it. But my point is simply that the incident certainly lent itself, in my view, to a more vigorous statement by the government than that was actually given, other than denying that they had anything to do with it, in response to baseless allegations that they did have something to do with it. Other than that, The Indian government basically said nothing.
In fact, if I recall that trip, the only real plain speaking came from the Chief Minister of Punjab, Amrinder Singh, at that time, who was very blunt.
Correct. Yes, it was at the time a very convenient arrangement for Prime Minister Narendra Modi to let Captain Amarinder be the hard cop and to go after, be the bad cop, I guess,
yes.
And to go after the Khalistanis and to take Canada to task, which he did much more vigorously, refusing on one previous occasion to meet with Harjit Sajjan, the Liberal Minister for Defence from Vancouver South, and eventually agreeing to meet him rather reluctantly in the company of Justin Trudeau. But he made his point pretty well that, you know, he just didn't even want to meet with this guy. Well, that's something that the Indian government would never have done because, as I say, too polite. Now, if, say, back in 1982, Indira Gandhi's government had said to Pierre Trudeau, "What do you mean you're not going to extradite this terrorist? This guy's wanted for the murder of 2 policemen in India. We've asked for his extradition to be tried for murder, and you're refusing?" And Canada's reasons, by the way, I won't get into them now, but Canada's reasons for refusing that extradition request were absurd in the extreme. Something to do with, oh, well, India doesn't accept the Queen as head of state, and therefore the Commonwealth Extradition Treaty, blah, 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 blah. It's some sort of bureaucratic nonsense. It was laughable, really. The real reason was we didn't want to antagonize Sikh voters in Canada. That's why they didn't extradite. But if Indira Gandhi had said to Trudeau, and they had a good rapport, they had a good personal rapport. It was reported, for example, that they would meditate together, dismiss their aides from bilateral meetings, and sit there silently meditating together for as long as 15 minutes while the aides outside the room say, "What's going on?" So there's no doubt that they had a rapport. Imagine if Indira Gandhi said, "Look, this just isn't good enough, and I'm going to say something publicly when we have our press conference. I'm going to embarrass you in public. Well, you know, this guy's a murderer, and we want him extradited, and stop making excuses." Then it might have been a bit more difficult. And then and continuing on to the incident that we've just discussed with Justin Trudeau's visit. I do think that the Indian government could have been more vigorous, and I know that they have their reasons, and I know that they have been more vigorous privately, but sometimes you got to make it public. You've got to embarrass even a friendly government in public and say, look, you got to step up.
Well, Terry, thank you so much. We have overshot our time, and I think it is unreasonable to hold you on much further, but I am very certainly going to continue this discussion. It's been very, very interesting, and I do hope we will go into further details in our next conversation. I'd like to thank all our participants and apologize to some of the people who sent in their questions and comments. I haven't been able to accommodate all of you despite our time extension. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Terry.